Jackson Taylor was only 19 years old, but the airport already knew his name. In the small regional airport where he worked as a young aircraft mechanic, Jackson had a reputation for noticing things others missed. It wasn't just the engines, the controls, or the fuel lines. He could hear planes in ways others couldn't, sensing vibrations, subtle shifts in pressure, and even the invisible flow of air around wings. Today, as he tightened his gloves and checked his toolbox, he felt a tension in the air that set his nerves on edge. The sky was a strange mix of gray clouds and sunlight. Flight 518, a mid-sized passenger plane, was preparing for takeoff. Families, business travelers, and students settled into their seats, unaware of the growing danger above. Jackson stood near the runway, his eyes scanning every movement of the aircraft. The clouds weren't just normal formations. They were dense, rolling, and layered in a way that suggested turbulence and instability. The air had a heaviness that pressed down on the tarmac, a subtle force that made him feel the danger even before the engine started. He approached the plane carefully, tapping the fuselage with his gloved hands. The vibrations were normal for a fully fueled aircraft, yet something in the way the wings and tail quivered gave him pause. Engines roared to life, powerful and steady, but Jackson's instincts told him the problem wasn't mechanical. The danger lay not in the metal or the machinery, it was in the clouds and the air itself, forces invisible to most eyes. Capable of overwhelming even a skilled pilot, Jackson ran his fingers along the wing, listening to the hum and the subtle vibrations. His mind raced, recalling simulations and textbooks he had studied at night. He thought of air pressure pockets, wind shear, and how dense storm clouds could create sudden, violent turbulence. He remembered scenarios where even experienced pilots had struggled to maintain control in similar conditions. The math, the physics, the behavior of air, it all clicked in his mind simultaneously, forming a warning that no radar could yet show. Flight 518 began taxiing down the runway. The engines grew louder, and the tires squealed against the asphalt. The pilot, a young woman named Emily Carter, waved at the ground crew, smiling confidently. Passengers chatted, some glancing out the windows at the thickening clouds above. From their perspective, everything seemed normal. From Jackson's, the plane was heading straight into a hidden trap. He muttered under his breath, "This isn't just a storm. It's a wall." The cloud formations above were moving unnaturally fast, layered like ocean waves, twisting and shifting in unpredictable patterns. Wind gusts blew across the plane, rattling panels and shaking the nose slightly. If the plane continued without adjustment, it could enter a pressure pocket that would make lift inconsistent and could even destabilize the aircraft before it reached a safe altitude. Jackson's heart began to race. His mind calculated the plane's speed, weight, and climb angle against the changing weather. Each variable added to the danger, yet no one else seemed aware. The control tower cleared the plane for takeoff. The engines roared. The plane accelerated down the runway, gradually lifting its nose. Passengers smiled nervously, unaware that their flight was already brushing against a hidden threat. Jackson's fists clenched. He ran a few steps alongside the runway, watching the plane's movement carefully. He could feel the storm's pressure pressing against the aircraft. Lightning streaked faintly in the clouds, and the wind shifted erratically. Every second counted, and Jackson realized with a sinking feeling that his instincts might be the only thing standing between disaster and safety. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. Today, the danger was not something he could fix with a wrench. It was a force of nature, invisible yet deadly. And as Flight 518 picked up speed and began to lift toward the clouds, Jackson Taylor knew that this was the moment when his attentiveness, experience, and courage would truly be tested. The moment Flight 518 lifted off the runway, Jackson Taylor's anxiety spiked. The plane rose smoothly at first, but the sky above was no longer ordinary. Dark, ominous clouds swirled, lightning arcing within them. Wind gusts hit the aircraft's nose unevenly, creating small, sudden jolts. Even the engine sounds, powerful as they were, seemed slightly off, as if the invisible turbulence above fought against the aircraft's thrust. Jackson ran alongside the runway, waving his arms frantically. His voice carried only faintly over the roar of the engines, but he hoped someone in the control tower or a nearby mechanic would notice. His heart raced, and every instinct screamed that Flight 518 was entering a dangerous zone of extreme air pressure and storm turbulence. A situation that could overwhelm even the most skilled pilot. Inside the cockpit, Emily Carter, the young pilot, immediately sensed something unusual. The plane shuddered slightly as it hit the first gusts of wind within the lower clouds. The altimeter fluctuated, the lift seemed inconsistent, and the throttle responded with a slight delay. Emily's eyes scanned her instruments, then the horizon, calculating in seconds the safest way to navigate this invisible wall of air. This isn't normal, she murmured, gripping the yoke tightly. The plane pitched and rolled subtly, as though struggling against an invisible resistance. The passengers, unaware of the danger, held their seats with varying levels of curiosity and anxiety. Outside, the clouds twisted, thick and foreboding, lightning streaking closer with each passing second. Jackson's eyes followed the plane intently. He could see every subtle movement of the wings, every hesitation in the lift. He remembered simulations he had studied, how air pressure could create pockets in the atmosphere, areas where lift decreased unpredictably, turbulence intensified, and control became sluggish. He calculated the plane's weight, fuel load, and speed, matching it against the pressure fluctuations he could sense even from the ground. The numbers aligned with his instincts. The plane was in serious danger. Emily fought to keep Flight 518 steady. The plane's nose dipped slightly into a pocket of turbulence, then lifted again, fighting the storm. She adjusted the throttle and pitched constantly, but the storm above was relentless. Lightning illuminated the clouds, revealing jagged, chaotic layers that no radar could fully capture. Jackson shouted, hoping to reach someone in the control tower. His legs ached from running along the tarmac, his hands waved frantically, but no one seemed to notice him in time. From his vantage point, he had to trust that Emily could feel the same danger through the yoke, that her skill and instincts would match the severity of the storm. The plane shuddered violently as a strong gust hit the wing, tilting it slightly. Passengers screamed, and some cried out in fear. Emily pushed forward and back on the yoke, adjusting the plane's pitch to maintain lift. The instruments blinked, responding slowly, as though the storm itself was bending the rules of physics. Each second seemed to stretch longer than the last. Jackson's mind raced. He visualized the storm's movement, the turbulence zones, and the density of the clouds. If Flight 518 climbed too quickly, the upper pressure pockets could stall the wings. If it climbed too slowly, the plane would remain in the storm's heart. Every variable was a threat, every choice a potential disaster. Then, Emily made a split-second decision. She leveled the plane, carefully negotiating a path along the edge of the most turbulent layer. The aircraft shook violently as it passed through the thickest cloud, but she maintained control. Lightning flashed, rain pounded the fuselage, and wind tore across the wings, but Flight 518 stabilized enough to climb steadily. Jackson exhaled, relief mixed with lingering fear. The invisible storm had challenged the plane, the pilot, and every passenger on board. But his instincts, combined with Emily's skill, had kept the aircraft in one piece. The storm had tested them, and they had survived, though the danger was far from over. Asterisk as Flight 518 climbed into clearer air above the storm. Jackson stood still, staring at the disappearing aircraft. His hands shook slightly from the adrenaline, his clothes damp with sweat. He realized something profound. In aviation, lives are not only saved by instruments or experience, but by attention, intuition, and courage. Asterisk in that day, Jackson Taylor understood that he had contributed to that survival not by climbing into the cockpit, but by trusting his instincts and noticing the danger when no one else could. The plane had faced the storm, but the storm had met a young mechanic who refused to ignore it. Asterisk. After Flight 518 finally cleared the storm and touched down safely on the runway, the airport erupted into controlled chaos. Emergency crews inspected the plane immediately, scanning for damage, checking the engines, wings, and landing gear. Passengers were shaken but unharmed, many still clutching their armrests, their faces pale from fear. Despite the harrowing flight, no mechanical failure was found. The plane had endured the storm unscathed, but the investigation revealed a new and alarming truth. The danger had come entirely from the extreme turbulence and air pressure variations within the storm clouds. Asterisk Jackson Taylor, still standing near the runway, observed the scene with a mixture of relief and curiosity. He had known, from the first moment Flight 518 began its ascent, that the storm carried hidden threats, air pressure pockets, violent gusts, and dense, shifting clouds that could destabilize the aircraft without warning. As the engineers and investigators combed through the instruments, Jackson approached cautiously, hoping to contribute the perspective that only someone observing from the ground could offer. Asterisk Mr. Taylor called a senior investigator, a tall man named Henry Collins. "We'd like to hear your observations." Henry's tone was respectful, but urgent. The airport authorities knew that while instruments could capture readings, they could not interpret instinct. Jackson nodded, swallowing the lingering adrenaline. He had prepared to describe what he had noticed, the way the plane moved in the wind, the subtle shivers in the wings, the way the storm seemed to press down differently at various altitudes. Asterisk Jackson spoke clearly, recounting each detail. He described the density and movement of the clouds, the gusts that rattled the aircraft even before takeoff, and the unusual pressure that made the plane feel heavier as it lifted. He explained how he had watched Flight 518 struggle against invisible forces, and how he had realized that the plane's climb would be inconsistent unless the pilot adjusted constantly. Every observation aligned with the recorded data. Asterisk the investigators listened intently, some nodding in agreement. Henry Collins turned to the lead pilot, Emily Carter, who had stepped out of the cockpit after debriefing with control tower personnel. "Do you recognize what he's saying?" Collins asked. Asterisk Emily's eyes softened with respect. "Absolutely," she said. "Jackson's observations match what we experienced in the air. The instrument showed unusual readings, but even they didn't fully capture the turbulence and pressure variations. Having someone on the ground notice it, and at the exact moment, gave me the seconds I needed to stabilize the aircraft." Asterisk Jackson felt a mix of pride and humility. He had never sought recognition. He had only relied on his training, instincts, and attentiveness. Yet now he realized that intuition combined with knowledge could save lives. The investigators nodded and took detailed notes, agreeing that Jackson's observations had been crucial to preventing a disaster. Asterisk Henry Collins leaned closer to Jackson. "You noticed this before anyone else," he said quietly. "Even the tower, even our instruments, your awareness was critical. Without your attention, the plane could have entered a more dangerous layer of the storm. You likely saved many lives today." Jackson's hands trembled slightly. The adrenaline that had fueled him on the runway was slowly giving way to reflection. He glanced at Emily Carter, who offered a small smile, acknowledging that his quiet vigilance had made the difference. He realized that heroism did not always involve climbing into the cockpit or performing daring feats in the sky. Sometimes it was standing on the ground, watching carefully, and acting decisively when it mattered most. The investigation continued over several hours, analyzing flight data, storm patterns, and wind speeds. The final report concluded that the extreme turbulence and unusual air pressure pockets in the storm had been the primary danger. Flight 518 had survived because of a combination of the pilot's skill and Jackson Taylor's keen observations. By the end of the day, Jackson understood a deeper truth. Aviation depended not only on machines and instruments, but also on people who could perceive, analyze, and respond to subtle warnings. Those few seconds of awareness, the ability to notice what others could not, were sometimes all that stood between safety and catastrophe. As the sun dipped behind the clouds, Jackson walked away from the runway, still feeling the adrenaline in his veins. He knew that the storm had tested every skill, instinct, and nerve he possessed, and that his quick attention to detail had helped guide Flight 518 safely to the ground. It was a lesson he would carry with him forever. Sometimes the most important hero in the sky is the one standing on solid ground, watching, noticing, and trusting what they know to be true. Days after the harrowing flight of Flight 518, the airport had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but for Jackson Taylor, nothing felt ordinary. He walked along the tarmac, the smell of jet fuel sharp in the cool morning air, yet his thoughts were elsewhere on the storm, the plane, and the invisible forces he had sensed. At 19 years old, Jackson had already learned more about responsibility and vigilance than many professionals acquired in decades. The events of that day had changed him, reshaping his understanding of aviation, heroism, and the delicate balance between man and machine. The airport staff had implemented new safety measures after the incident. Meteorologists were now consulted before every flight, and pre-flight checks included detailed analysis of cloud formations, wind patterns, and air pressure fluctuations. Pilots were briefed on areas of potential turbulence, and additional ground personnel were trained to observe aircraft behavior during takeoff. Among these changes, one decision stood out. Jackson Taylor had been assigned a new role in pre-flight atmospheric monitoring, responsible for reporting subtle changes in weather and air pressure before any plane took off. Standing near the runway that morning, Jackson watched a small passenger jet line up for departure. The sky was mostly clear, but scattered clouds loomed on the horizon. He adjusted his glasses and checked his instruments, then lifted his gaze to the clouds, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Every passenger's life now depended not just on engines, instruments, and pilots, but also on his ability to notice subtle shifts, to sense what could not yet be measured. Emily Carter, the pilot from Flight 518, arrived at the airport that day for a routine flight. She greeted Jackson with a smile, a gesture of acknowledgement for the part he had played in saving her aircraft and its passengers. "Ready for another smooth takeoff?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes serious. Jackson smiled faintly, aware of the truth behind her words. Smooth takeoffs were never guaranteed. There was always the sky, the weather, and the unpredictable forces that could turn a routine flight into a life-or-death scenario. As the engines powered up, Jackson felt the familiar hum through the tarmac. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing not just on the sound, but on the energy of the air, the pull of the wind, and the shifting pressure around the plane. He noted the cloud formations, the subtle gusts, and the potential turbulence along the planned flight path. Unlike before, he now had authority to make real-time recommendations. Unlike before, his voice mattered. The plane lifted smoothly, climbing into the sky, and Jackson exhaled, feeling a wave of relief. The storm that had haunted Flight 518 was gone, replaced by scattered clouds and a calm breeze. Yet Jackson understood that vigilance was never optional. Every flight carried risk, and even the smallest miscalculation or overlooked detail could have catastrophic consequences. His role had shifted from observer to guardian, a quiet, indispensable presence ensuring that others could perform their jobs safely. Later that afternoon, Jackson walked through the hangar with a new sense of purpose. Mechanics and engineers were busy with routine maintenance, but he paused to consider the bigger picture. Aviation was more than machinery. It was a network of people, each relying on the other to notice, interpret, and act. The pilot controlled the plane, but the mechanic controlled understanding. The instruments measured, but the human mind discerned. And Jackson Taylor, at 19, had learned that awareness, intuition, and courage were just as crucial as training and experience. Reflecting on Flight 518, he realized that heroism was rarely dramatic. It wasn't always a daring maneuver in midair or a last-second action in the cockpit. Sometimes it was trusting instincts, standing firm on the ground, and refusing to ignore subtle warnings. Every measurement he took, every observation he recorded, every recommendation he made could save lives. That day had taught him that quiet attentiveness could be more heroic than bravado. As evening approached, Jackson stood at the edge of the fades of the runway, watching planes ascend into the fading sunlight. The sky was streaked with oranges and purples, clouds drifting lazily above. A small jet lifted gracefully, its engines humming in harmony with the air currents. Jackson felt the familiar vibration through the solace of his boots and smiled. Each flight was a reminder of responsibility, of trust, and of the delicate relationship between man and machine. He thought of Flight 518, the storm, and the invisible dangers above. That day had been a test of skill, awareness, and courage. Jackson had passed, and from that moment on, he vowed never to stop observing, never to dismiss a subtle